This is Elle Baker here, and I'm here to speak with key informant Veronica Eady. She is Vice President and Director of Conservation Law in Massachusetts. Veronica, could you tell us a little bit about conservation law?
We're Conservation Law Foundation. So we were founded in 1966. We are an environmental advocacy organization focused regionally on New England. We work in all 6 New England states. The Massachusetts office here is the headquarters. We have 4 key programs. We work on clean energy and climate change. We work on oceans and fisheries issues. We work on clean water and healthy forests, and the 4th program is healthy communities and environmental justice. Through these programs, we have a stable of lawyers, so we file lawsuits to enforce environmental laws and regulations. We have economists on staff, we have investment fund developers, as well as other researchers. And so we have this toolbox that includes law, science, and the market to address environmental issues throughout New England. Almost my entire career has been focused on environmental justice work. In the last year, I've expanded my portfolio of work when I became the director of this office. Now I'm also doing some work around power plant issues, working with community groups that are trying to combat power plants or clean up power plants and develop clean energy sources. I have had some meetings with DEP, particularly around environmental justice issues and around them implementing the Massachusetts environmental justice policy and developing programs that protect communities from hazards in their environment that might be toxic or have other public health and environmental impacts on communities. So in that sense, I have done a lot with DEP. We have an environmental justice policy here in Massachusetts currently. I was the principal author of that policy. Right now I have 2 pieces of litigation against DEP. One is to compel DEP to issue regulations under the State Global Warming Solutions Act. And we argue that that statute requires DEP to issue regulations that annually ratchet down greenhouse gases. I have another lawsuit where I'm working with a group in Springfield called Arise for Social Justice. That group is fighting a biomass plant that's been cited for their neighborhood in Springfield. Our environmental regulatory system is based mostly on a framework where you have the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and you have a body of federal laws. And the state laws mirror the federal laws. If it is a federal program that EPA has delegated to the state, when the states issue their own regulations, those regulations have to be at least as stringent as the state. So under the Clean Air Act, DEP will write a state implementation plan, which is a body of state regulations that basically address the same issues that the Federal Clean Air Act might address, but in a plan that is tailored to our state and tailored to our unique circumstances in our state. EPA then approves DEP's state implementation plan. Okay. And then what that means is that DEP can enforce this federally approved plan, but if DEP fails to enforce it, there are 2 things that can happen. Organizations like CLF can sue DEP to compel them to enforce whatever regulation it is. But first we send them a notice of intent to sue, and there's a 60-day window where EPA can decide, you know what, we're going to enforce this for DEP. So you have a situation where there are 3 parties that can enforce this state implementation plan. It could be DEP, it could be a citizens group or an environmental advocacy organization, or the federal EPA can enforce it. I have a real concern about DEP over the last several years, and most recently they've lost a lot of staff. You know, there's a trend nationally to decrease staffs of environmental agencies. It's happening on the federal level at EPA. I had a conversation with Gina McCarthy where she talked about how the EPA has lost thousands of employees over the last several years because of budget cuts. And here in Massachusetts, Governor Baker recently completed a program where a number of executive branch staff were offered an early retirement package. That resulted in DEP losing over 120 people. Some positions will be rehired, but as is with the private sector, the idea is that you get rid of these people who've been around, who have a lot of experience, who are earning a higher salary, and replacing them with people who are less experienced and are willing to work for less money. We have a problem where not only has DEP lost over 120 people, but if and when they are able to fill some of those positions, they will be filled most likely with people who don't have the wealth of expertise and knowledge as those people who've retired. In the early 2000s, I worked really closely with DPH because I wanted to make sure in crafting an EJ policy that we were really considering every kind of way that we could identify a community that's in trouble. So right now, the original policy and the one that's going through revisions right now identifies communities that might be at risk by basically applying what is true nationally, that low-income communities and people of color communities bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens. I was really interested in working with the Department of Public Health to see if there were any public health indicators that might also be helpful. So we talked about cancer, we talked about asthma. Asthma could potentially be an indicator, and I know that they're looking at that in the new policy, and I certainly looked at it before. One problem with asthma is that, as I understand it, most asthma rates that are tracked by hospitalization. So if you don't take your kid to the hospital, or if your kid doesn't go to the school nurse or whatever, they don't necessarily get tracked, which means that asthma rates can be a lot worse than we think that they are. Cancer is a little bit more complicated because we are exposed to so many different things during the course of the day. In traffic or on the T, we eat different things, and it's really hard to track what cancers are really significant and connected to the environment. Having said that, I know that in Massachusetts there are cancer clusters around the state that DPH is studying and giving a deeper look. And so to the extent that Department of Public Health is taking one of those deeper looks, cancer could be a helpful indicator. And the other thing I would just say about cancer is that when a community like Saugus that notices anecdotally that you have a lot of cancers in your community, it might be worth reaching out to the Department of Public Health and making sure that they're aware of it and try to get them to take a deeper look at what's happening and what the exposure pathways might be. Years ago, when I first moved to Massachusetts back in 1998, I was in contact with a bunch of residents in North Andover who had the Wheelabrator incinerator in North Andover, and they were really concerned about it. I did a lot of counseling with them and trying to devise strategies. What they were striving for at that time was to get the incinerator closed. Basically, the community group told me they'd been sold a bill of goods, that this was a waste-to-energy facility and it was going to be really great, and then all they got was pollution, dioxin, for which there's no safe level. CLF sues on behalf of its members. If we have a member in a particular area, say Saugus, then we can sue on behalf of our members for whatever the reason might be. To become a member, all you have to do really is to make a donation to CLF, and you can do that on our website. And as a member, you receive our newsletter, which is called Conservation Matters, that updates on the various programs and things that we're working on. It would include being on our email listserv, so you get our updates, and you might get action alerts from us if we, say, want our members to call their legislator or the governor or whatever the issue might be. Invitations to CLF events, as I said, might sue the state DEP. We might sue the EPA, depending on what the issue is, to compel the EPA to do something that they were supposed to do. For example, filed a lawsuit on Cape Cod against the EPA to require the water quality agencies on Cape Cod to update their area-wide management plan for stormwater. The Clean Water Act sets forth a penalty scheme that says that violators can be held for a certain amount of money per violation per day. So those penalties rack up depending on what statute it is and what the statute says. And most of the environmental statutes, federal and state, that are statutes that can be enforced in that way for a violation for polluting. Most of them do have some penalty provision so that the violator is required to not only comply with the permit or get a permit if they don't have one, but they can be held liable for penalties, which can be negotiated, but the statute lays out how many thousands of dollars per day that each violator and each violation can rack up. And then those statutes also often have an attorney's fees provision. Normally, CLF is funded by donations and grants from philanthropic foundations. In those cases, in our enforcement project, where the statute says that we would be entitled to attorney's fees, then we're actually able to collect fees so that that program can be self-supporting and self-sustaining. Typically, DEP will have written its own regulations depending again on what the statute is. Many of the federal statutes would require DEP to write its own regulations that have to be at least as stringent as the federal. We might sue the EPA, and we have sued entities before, and I'll give you an example. One of our projects is our environmental enforcement project, and what that project does is it files lawsuits against organizations or companies that should have stormwater permits, but they don't have stormwater permits, and they continue to function in their operation. If you have a scrap metal facility that is operating near the Taunton River and is discharging stormwater, because stormwater seeps into, it seeps off of pavement when it rains, or it might go through the groundwater and into the Taunton River. So we sue then those companies. When we do file those lawsuits against companies, what we always try to do is participate in a program that's called a Supplemental Environmental Projects Program. Normally, when you sue a company under a federal statute, those penalties that the company is assessed through that litigation go back into the general treasury. So people in Massachusetts might never see however much, $50,000, $100,000, however much the penalties are. So through this supplemental environmental project, we're able to get a portion of those penalties directed back into the watershed for the improvement of the watershed. So say there was a discharger on the Saugus River, we would try to find an organization that works within that watershed to improve that watershed. We'll ask the court if we can get money directed towards them because we know that their projects are going to improve the water quality in the Saugus River. So we work with other organizations in that way to try to redirect money. Speaking in my experience, DEP is willing to talk to community residents. What I advise communities is when they see a problem, and from my perspective, clearly there's a problem in Saugus with the Wheelabrator Ashland fill facility. It's important to stay in front of DEP's face. I would recommend that communities meet with DEP, and not just with whoever it is that is managing the consent order, or who, the scientist or engineer that's assigned to Wheelabrator. I say go to sit down with the commissioner. I would recommend that they speak with the Secretary for Energy and Environmental Affairs to make sure that he's aware that there's a situation there.